5th, 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler was already dead. But in the mountains of Austria, one German officer refused his final order: fight to the last man. Instead, he turned his guns against his own, against the SS, to save over 300 Americans trapped in a war that should have been over. His name was Major Joseph Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer who chose conscience over command. This is the true story of the man who risked execution by his own side to do what was right, and became the only German officer in history honored by both sides. As dawn broke over the Tyrolean Alps, the mountains stood silent, cold witnesses to a dying empire. From his position near the village edge, Major Joseph Gangl watched smoke drifting through the valley, thick, black ribbons curling over rooftops and pine forests. It wasn't fog. It was the Reich itself, burning. April 1945. The war that had promised 1,000 years of glory was now choking on its final days. The German army was no longer an army. It was a collection of ghosts, soldiers without orders, commanders without command, loyalties without meaning. Roads once built for victory parades now crawled with retreating men and broken machines. The Americans were pushing west through Bavaria, their columns of Sherman tanks rolling past villages still marked with swastika flags, crushing the emblems of a dying ideology beneath their treads. The Red Army, meanwhile, was tearing through Berlin, turning the capital into rubble and flame. In between these two unstoppable forces lay millions of civilians, refugees trudging through mud, mothers clutching infants, soldiers discarding weapons to blend into the crowds. The Third Reich, once hailed as eternal, had been reduced to frightened footsteps in the rain. But not everyone accepted the end. In the rugged valleys of the Austrian Tyrol, where surrender was seen as sin, the SS still fought on. They were men consumed by the myth of loyalty, the kind who believed that dying for Hitler was more sacred than living without him. They called themselves faithful unto death. And they made sure that anyone who dared to speak of peace didn't live long enough to say it twice. Villagers who lowered Nazi flags were executed. Farmers who refused to surrender their food were shot. Even German soldiers who hesitated to follow impossible orders were branded traitors and hanged. The war was ending, but the killing hadn't. Gangl knew these men. He'd served beside them once. For 6 long years, he'd fought across Europe under the banner of the Wehrmacht's 2nd Panzer Division. He'd seen triumph and retreat, loyalty and madness, and somewhere along the way the line between right and wrong had vanished in the smoke of artillery. But now, standing at the edge of a valley he'd once called home, he realized something that many of his comrades never would. The Reich was dead, but its ghosts were still killing the living. In the nearby town of Wurgl, the streets were littered with abandoned vehicles. Trucks with empty fuel tanks, bicycles twisted by explosions, and carts piled high with what remained of families fleeing the front. At night, the only light came from burning barns. Mothers whispered prayers through cracked window panes. Children flinched at every rumble from the mountains, unsure if it was thunder or artillery. And through that fragile darkness the SS still prowled, hunting for deserters, punishing defeatists, and forcing terrified townspeople to dig trenches they would never use. Gangl watched it all in silence, the static of his field radio crackling in the background. A few of his remaining soldiers stood nearby, faces hollow from hunger and sleeplessness. They were waiting for orders, but none came. Berlin was gone. The chain of command had dissolved. The only sound that carried was Hitler's recorded voice, replaying endlessly through the static, the dictator's final words from his bunker. Fight to the last man, surrender is treason. Gangl reached over and turned the radio off. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, he could hear the wind moving through the pine trees, the faint drip of melting snow, and the distant cry of a church bell from the valley. He thought of the faces he'd seen over 6 years, comrades buried in the mud of France, civilians frozen on the roads of Russia, young recruits trembling under bombardment. All of it for a cause that had devoured its own sons. The man who had once believed in discipline and duty now understood something else. Obedience without conscience is not honor, it's surrender of the soul. Gangl turned to his driver, a boy barely 20, and spoke quietly. Enough killing. The words didn't sound like rebellion. They sounded like exhaustion, the kind that comes when a man has seen too much and finally chooses to stop running from his conscience. In that moment, under the gray Austrian dawn, he made his decision. He would no longer fight for a man in a bunker. He would no longer burn villages for victories that no longer existed. From that moment forward, he would fight for something real, for people who still had a chance to live. The order that came next wasn't written in any field manual. It came from a place much deeper. For the first time in 6 years, Joseph Gangle decided to fight for something not because he was told to, but because it was right. The town of Wurgel lay tucked in the shadow of the Tyrolean Alps, quiet, cold, and heavy with fear. Once, it had been the kind of place people passed through without a thought, a farming community surrounded by meadows, its church spire glinting above the Inn River. Before the war, you could hear the church bells echo across the valley, followed by children's laughter from the market square. But now, in May 1945, those same streets were lined with ash and shattered glass. The war's front had dissolved, and Wurgel had become a place of uneasy silence, caught between surrender and vengeance. To the west, American armor was pushing closer each day from Kufstein. To the east, SS units, bitter, desperate, and afraid of retribution, were retreating through the valley, burning everything they could not hold. These were not soldiers seeking peace. They were men still clinging to a lost cause, terrified of being seen as cowards, determined to prove their loyalty to a leader already dead. Their orders were simple. Hold your ground. Punish all traitors. Fight to the last man. In Wurgel, that meant the nightmare was far from over. When the SS entered the town, they demanded the civilians take up arms. Old men, teenage boys, even priests. Those who hesitated were dragged into the streets. Some were beaten. Others were shot. Mothers hid their sons in barns and root cellars. Children were told to stay quiet, to pretend to sleep while the walls trembled from distant artillery. The people of Wurgel didn't want glory. They wanted the war to end. They wanted to wake up to a morning without gunfire. And standing in the middle of this chaos was Major Joseph Gangle. A career artillery officer, Wehrmacht 2nd Panzer Division, Gangle had spent years serving across Europe. In France, in Russia, in places where maps no longer mattered because everything had already been destroyed. He had obeyed orders long enough to know what blind obedience had done. He'd seen soldiers freeze to death in the east, die for ground no one would remember. He'd seen civilians caught in the crossfire, and he'd seen the face of fanaticism in his own ranks. Now, as the Reich collapsed around him, Gangle faced a final choice, one that no military training could prepare him for. The SS demanded that he help hold Wurgel, to turn it into a fortress and make its citizens fight. But Gangle had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to fight for Berlin anymore. He was going to fight for Wurgel. Gathering the few men left under his command, a handful of weary veterans and teenage conscripts, he gave an order that could have cost him his life. "We defend this town," he said quietly, "but not from the Americans. From the SS." His men looked at him in disbelief. To resist the SS was treason. To cooperate with civilians was betrayal. Yet, something in Gangle's voice made them stay. "The war is lost," he told them. "But our honor is not." That night, he moved through the town square, coordinating with the local Austrian resistance. A small, courageous group of teachers, farmers, and railway workers who had secretly organized to protect their neighbors. Together, they began transforming Wurgel into a refuge instead of a battlefield. Barricades were built, not to keep the Allies out, but to block SS convoys from entering. Gangle ordered road signs removed and bridges rigged for demolition, not to stop Americans but to slow German reinforcements. When word spread that the SS planned to execute several villagers accused of defeatism, Gangle intervened personally. Armed with nothing but his uniform and authority, he confronted an SS patrol on the edge of town. Eyewitnesses would later recall the tension. The black uniformed officer shouting, Gangle standing his ground, hand resting on his sidearm but refusing to draw it. Somehow he convinced them to leave. He returned to the square in silence, his men waiting. "We bought them a few more hours," he said. "That's enough for now." In those hours, Wurgel became something rare, a sliver of humanity in the dying body of the Reich. Civilians carried food to Gangle's men. A local priest gave last rites to soldiers on both sides. And for the first time in weeks, no gunfire echoed through the night. But everyone knew it couldn't last. The SS would return, and when they did, they'd bring more than orders. They'd bring vengeance. For Gangle, there was no turning back. His decision had already sealed his fate. To Hitler's regime, he was now a defector. To Wurgel, he was their protector. To history, he would become something greater. A soldier who found redemption not through victory, but through conscience. In the morning light, as the church bell tolled across the valley, Gangle looked over his town, his last command, and whispered to one of his men, "If we die here, let it be for something that still matters." Just as the town of Wurgel began to breathe again, fate sent Gangle a message from the mountains. It came in the form of a man barely standing, his uniform torn, his hands frostbitten, his face gray from exhaustion. His name was Andreas Krobot, a Czech cook who had escaped from a fortress just 15 kilometers away, Castle Itter. Between gasps, Krobot told a story so unbelievable that Gangel at first thought it delirium. The SS had abandoned the castle, he said. The guards had fled days earlier when the front collapsed. But inside the fortress, trapped behind stone walls and locked gates, were some of France's most important prisoners. Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister of France. Edouard Daladier, another ex-Prime Minister. General Maurice Gamelin, who once led France's army. And even Jean Barotra, the French tennis champion once hailed as the bounding Basque. These men had been seized years earlier as enemies of the Reich, trophies of Nazi conquest, and now in the chaos they'd been forgotten. The castle stood isolated above the village of Itter, surrounded by SS diehards still roaming the countryside. The French VIPs were alone, armed with only a handful of weapons left behind by their guards. If no one helps, Krobot said, the SS will find them and kill everyone. He had walked through the night, crossing bombed bridges and mountain trails under shellfire to reach help. And by pure chance, he had found the only man in the valley willing to risk everything to stop the killing. Major Joseph Gangel listened in silence, the map of the Tyrol spread out before him on a farmhouse table. His finger traced the narrow road to Itter, steep, exposed and crawling with SS patrols. To go there would mean certain death. But as Krobot spoke, Gangel's decision was already forming. You said there are French officers there? He asked. Krobot nodded. Then they will not die under our flag, Gangel said quietly. He turned to his aide, Sergeant Sepp Jensen, and gave his next order. Prepare the truck. Find any white cloth we can use. We're going to the Americans. For Gangel, this wasn't just another mission. It was the final act of his war. He would save the prisoners, or die trying. The convoy rolled out of Wurgel under a white flag tied to a radio antenna. Gangel rode in an old Opel Blitz truck, its Wehrmacht markings hastily scraped off, flanked by two soldiers too young to have ever seen peace. The road to Kufstein was littered with burned-out half-tracks and abandoned rifles, reminders of an army that had already surrendered in everything but name. Every mile they drove, Gangel expected to die. If the SS caught them, they'd be executed for treason. If the Americans saw them first, they'd be cut down before they could explain. But luck or something greater carried them through. By afternoon, the valley opened into the outskirts of Kufstein, where the first U.S. armored patrols had already arrived. American Sherman tanks stood guard at crossroads, barrels aimed toward the mountain passes. Soldiers in dusty uniforms watched as Gangel's truck approached, hands gripping their rifles. Gangel stepped out slowly, unarmed, his cap tucked under his arm. He raised his hands, speaking in broken English. German officer, not enemy, need help. The Americans hesitated. Then one man approached, tall, lean, his helmet pushed back just enough to reveal eyes that looked more curious than hostile. Lieutenant John Jack Lee Jr., commander of Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. In any other week of the war, they would have killed each other without hesitation. But this week the rules were gone. Gangel told him everything, about the French prisoners, the abandoned castle, and the SS units regrouping for a final assault. Lee listened without interrupting, his hand resting on the hull of his Sherman tank. When Gangel finished, Lee asked one question. You're telling me a German officer wants to fight the SS, with us? Gangel nodded. I fight only to protect lives now. No more killing for Hitler. For a moment there was silence, two men standing between the ashes of their nations, both tired of orders and blood. Then Lee extended his hand. All right, Major, he said. Let's go save those people. Gangel took it. That handshake, between a German artillery officer and an American tank commander, would become one of the rarest moments in history. Enemies by birth, allies by conscience. Together they planned the impossible. A joint German-American rescue mission, deep in SS territory. At dawn on May 5, 1945, two convoys rolled out of Kufstein, one under the American flag, the other under the German cross. They shared no language, no command structure, and no reason to trust each other, except one, the people trapped inside Castle Itter. Their combined force was pitiful by any measure of war. 14 Americans, led by Lieutenant Jack Lee Jr., armed with a single M4A3 Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny. 20 German soldiers, under Major Joseph Gangel, carrying what ammunition they could salvage from abandoned depots. They had no air cover, no supply line, no reinforcements coming. As they climbed the twisting alpine road toward the fortress, the air grew colder, thinner, and quieter. The valley below still burned with the dying embers of the Reich. Abandoned Panzer wrecks lay half-submerged in rivers, church bells hung silent, and the once proud banners of the Third Reich lay torn across fences and trees. Every curve of the mountain road could be an ambush. Every ridge might hide an SS sniper. The men knew the risk. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was still active in the region, desperate, fanatical, and armed. But neither Gangel nor Lee hesitated. The convoy moved in tense rhythm, the Sherman tank in front, its treads grinding against loose gravel, followed by 2 German trucks and a commandeered Volkswagen Kübelwagen bringing up the rear. Inside, soldiers from both armies sat shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms different but their fear the same. An American corporal offered a German private a cigarette. The young soldier hesitated, then accepted. For a moment, the war felt far away. Gangel rode in the second truck, scanning the treeline with his field glasses. He knew that if they were spotted, there would be no escape. "No one fires unless fired upon," he ordered. "We fight only if we must." As they climbed higher, the fortress appeared, Castle Itter, rising out of the forest like something from another century. Its gray stone towers caught the first light of morning, and for a fleeting second, it looked peaceful. But the peace was an illusion. Inside those walls, the French VIPs had been living in terror for days. Cut off, armed with only a handful of German rifles, they had taken turns keeping watch from the castle towers, waiting for salvation or death, whichever came first. When the sentries spotted movement in the valley below, they raised their binoculars and froze. Down the winding road came American uniforms and German helmets side by side, advancing together toward the castle gates. One of the prisoners, General Gamelin, could hardly believe his eyes. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "The war has finally gone mad." From the highest turret, the Frenchman waved a white sheet. The signal was answered by a flash from the Sherman tank's periscope. A beam of sunlight reflected back like a promise. For the first time in weeks, hope returned to Castle Itter. May 5, 1945. The sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when the first gunshot shattered the quiet. A German scout on the castle wall spotted movement in the tree line, black uniforms slipping through the pines. Then came the sound they'd all been dreading, the deep, rhythmic thump of MG-42 machine guns opening fire. The SS counterattack had begun. More than 150 Waffen-SS troops from the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division surrounded Castle Itter from 3 sides. They were armed with mortars, light artillery, and machine guns, determined to retake the fortress and wipe out what they saw as a traitor's stronghold. Inside, the defenders were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. 14 Americans, 20 German soldiers, and a handful of French VIPs, politicians, generals, and civilians who had spent the war imprisoned, now found themselves fighting for their lives together. The courtyard exploded in chaos. Mortar shells slammed into the outer walls, sending clouds of stone and dust raining down. Wooden shutters splintered. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountains. In the great hall, Lieutenant Jack Lee barked orders to his men, his voice hoarse but steady. "Hold your fire until you see targets. Make every shot count." Across from him, Major Joseph Gangel coordinated the German troops, assigning firing positions along the inner wall. Americans and Germans fought side by side, not as enemies but as brothers bound by survival. On the ramparts, French prisoners who once led armies now manned machine guns scavenged from abandoned positions. General Maurice Gamelin, the former French commander-in-chief, passed ammunition boxes up the stairs. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, sprinted between towers carrying belts of ammo, his white shirt flashing through the smoke. For the first time in years, men from nations that once hated each other were united, not by politics but by necessity. The SS fired relentlessly. The castle's outer walls were pitted with bullet holes, its main gate blown apart. Lee's lone Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, held position near the entrance, its 75mm gun thundering into the forest until a mortar shell crippled its tracks. The tank crew bailed out, setting up machine gun nests behind its smoking hull. As the hours passed, ammunition ran low. The defenders rotated rifles, firing single shots to conserve what was left. Gangel moved constantly, shouting directions, pulling wounded men back from the parapets, encouraging soldiers who could barely stand from exhaustion. Around mid-morning, a sniper's bullet smashed through a window and struck General Edouard Daladier's aide, wounding him badly. Without hesitation, Gangel ran across the open courtyard under fire to pull the man to cover. Lee yelled, "Joseph, get down!" But Gangel didn't stop. He grabbed the wounded French officer by the collar and dragged him behind a stone wall. A single shot cracked through the chaos, sharp, precise, final. Gangel staggered. The bullet had caught him clean in the head. He collapsed instantly, falling beside the man he'd just saved. For a moment, the castle fell silent. Even the gunfire seemed to fade. The German soldiers froze, staring at the man who had once commanded them, now lying still in the dust. Lieutenant Lee knelt beside him, checking for a pulse he knew wasn't there. "He's gone," he whispered. But there was no time to grieve. The SS were advancing again. The defenders redoubled their fire, anger replacing fear. An American gunner emptied a full belt into the forest line. A German grenadier lobbed the last of their Panzerfausts at an advancing squad, scattering the attackers. Inside, the French prisoners kept the ammunition flowing, their hands raw and shaking. Paul Reynaud, once Prime Minister of France, now crouched beside a .30 caliber machine gun, muttering prayers between bursts. Hours dragged on. The castle's defenders were nearly spent, 30 men against a sea of black uniforms. Yet somehow they held. By late afternoon, distant engines roared through the valley. A scout on the tower shouted, "Vehicles!" coming from the south. Through the smoke, they saw the glint of American stars on steel, reinforcements from the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 36th Division finally reaching them. As the new troops charged up the road, the SS line broke. Soldiers who had sworn to fight to the death threw down their weapons and vanished into the woods. The battle was over. But the cost of their victory lay motionless in the courtyard. Major Joseph Gangel, the German officer who had defied Hitler's last order and died protecting the very people his army once oppressed. The courtyard was nearly silent, only the echo of rifle shots fading into the mountains. Smoke drifted from the wreck of Besotten Jenny. The air smelled of cordite and wet stone. Then in the distance came the sound no one dared hope for. A low rumble, steady rising. Engines. The men on the wall leaned forward, straining to see through the haze. And then the shapes appeared, olive drab helmets, jeeps and half-tracks racing up the winding road. The 142nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 36th Division had arrived. They'd followed the sound of battle, climbing through the valley with every gun blazing. The defenders cheered as the first American vehicle burst through the tree line, .50 caliber guns cutting into the SS positions. Mortars fired, grenades exploded, and within minutes the tide turned completely. The SS, caught between the castle and the oncoming reinforcements, panicked. They scattered into the forest, leaving behind weapons, helmets, and bodies in the mud. Inside the walls, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. Soldiers who had spent the night firing shoulder to shoulder finally lowered their weapons. Some laughed in disbelief. Others wept. The French prisoners, men who had once stood at the center of European power, walked out into the sunlight, blinking like ghosts. Lieutenant Jack Lee stood at the castle gate, his uniform blackened with smoke, watching the Americans roll in. He said nothing, just nodded as a medic covered Joseph Gangel's body with a blanket. Around them, German and American soldiers stood side by side, staring out over the valley where the smoke was finally clearing. The battle was over. The unthinkable had happened. Americans and Germans had fought as brothers. For a brief moment in a dying war, the world had seen what humanity looked like on both sides of a rifle. The next morning, the smoke had cleared from the valley. The snowmelt carried down the faint echo of battle, now over forever. In the courtyard of Castle Itter, soldiers from two nations stood together for the last time. They helped gather the wounded, bury the dead, and share rations from whatever was left in their packs. For the Americans, the war was ending. For the Germans, something much deeper had ended. An era of blind obedience, broken by one man's refusal to follow orders. Major Joseph Gangel was laid to rest in the nearby town of Wurgel, not as an enemy, but as a soldier of conscience. His coffin was carried by men who had fought on both sides, Germans in faded gray and Americans in olive drab. When the final salute was fired, the rifles of both armies cracked together, 3 volleys that echoed through the valley like a promise. Gangel's grave still stands there today. A simple stone, surrounded by alpine flowers, bearing his name and the date of his final battle. May 5, 1945. Every year, American veterans and German townspeople leave their tributes. An American flag folded neatly beside a bouquet wrapped in the black, red, and gold of the new Germany. Above his grave, the inscription reads, "He died for freedom and humanity." Lieutenant Jack Lee Jr. was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the U.S. Army's highest honors, for his leadership at Castle Itter. but he often said the medal belonged as much to Gangel as to himself. The French prisoners, among them former Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, and Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, would never forget the German officer who risked everything for their lives. In their memoirs and letters, they wrote not about politics, but about a single act of moral courage that transcended uniforms and nations. To them, Joseph Gangel was not a traitor. He was proof that even in the dying light of war, humanity could still prevail. The story of Castle Itter became one of the most improbable and inspiring moments of World War II. The only recorded instance where American and German soldiers fought side by side against the SS. Decades later, historians would call it the strangest battle of the war. But for the men who lived it, it was simpler than that. It was the day when right and wrong finally mattered more than flags. The smoke over Wurgel eventually cleared. The echo of rifles faded into the valley wind. But the story of Major Joseph Gangel did not vanish with it. In those final days of the war, when the world was tearing itself apart, one man made a choice that still whispers through history, a choice to disobey when obedience meant complicity. Gangel had been a soldier of the Reich. A man raised in a world where honor was defined by obedience, where questioning an order could mean death. Yet, in the silence between one broadcast and the next, he realized something simple, something millions never did. That real courage isn't found in following orders. It's in knowing when to stop. His stand in Wurgel, his alliance with the Americans at Castle Itter, and his final act of sacrifice were not just moments of military history, they were moments of moral clarity. He had no flag left to fight for, no nation left to serve, no command left to obey. And yet, he found something greater, a purpose born from conscience. When he chose to protect civilians instead of power, when he crossed enemy lines to ask the Americans for help, when he stood shoulder to shoulder with men he'd once been ordered to kill, he didn't just save 300 lives. He saved something deeper. The proof that even in war humanity can survive. Gangel's story was nearly forgotten. His name appeared in no grand parades, no propaganda reels. For years, his grave in Wurgel sat quietly beneath the mountain wind, visited only by those who knew what he had done. But those who stood with him never forgot. The American soldiers he fought beside remembered his calm under fire, a German major calling out range corrections while SS mortars shattered the castle walls. The French prisoners who survived Castle Itter remembered the look in his eyes before he ran across the courtyard to save a wounded general, the last thing he ever did. When the war ended, the U.S. Army buried Joseph Gangel with full military honors. Not as an enemy, not as a traitor, but as a soldier who had rediscovered what honor really meant. His grave still stands today, a small marker beneath the Tyrolean sun, tended by locals and visited by both American and German veterans. On one side, a wreath wrapped in the stars and stripes. On the other, a bouquet tied with the black, red, and gold of a reborn Germany. And between them, a single engraving. He gave his life for peace. History remembers conquerors, but rarely the men who refuse to be monsters. Yet, sometimes, those are the ones who change everything. In Joseph Gangel's Defiance, we see the rarest form of heroism, the kind that comes not from victory but from redemption. A man who had fought for tyranny but died for compassion. A soldier who learned too late that the only battle worth fighting is the one for humanity itself. And so, when we speak of courage, we must remember this. True valor is not about how many you defeat. It's about how many you protect. In a war built on blind obedience, one soldier's disobedience became an act of mercy. Joseph Gangel proved that honor isn't about who you fight for, it's about who you protect. The mountains of Tyrol still stand silent. The castle still rises above the trees, its walls bearing scars from that impossible alliance. And if you listen closely through the rustle of pines and the echo of the river below, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of gunfire replaced by something softer. A church bell. A whisper. A reminder that even in the darkest times, light can still find its way through the cracks. This is Shadows of Valor, where history's silence finds a voice. Military medal if you believe these stories should never be forgotten. If you believe courage deserves to be remembered not for the medals it wins, but for the lives it saves, subscribe to join us. One story at a time, we bring light to the forgotten heroes who chose conscience over cruelty and humanity over hate. Because history doesn't just live in the victories. It lives in the moments when a single man standing against the tide decides to do what's right. This story is based on verified historical accounts of the battle for Castle Itter, drawn from official U.S. Army records, French eyewitness testimonies, and the book, The Last Battle by Stephen Harding, 2013.